I'm the founder of the Diversity Institute at Toronto Metropolitan University. And I'm really pleased to welcome you here today to this session that we've organized in partnership with Electricity Canada. So before we start, I just wanted to begin by acknowledging the land that the Diversity Institute is on in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And this land remains home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, Métis people, and is covered by Treaty 13. Today, I think the issue of Indigenous inclusion, truth and reconciliation is particularly pertinent given the work that you do and we do. And many of you know that the university that I'm currently at has changed its name in part as it's part of its commitment to truth and reconciliation. So today's session is the culmination of the Energizing Talent Conversation Series, which has been a national dialogue between leaders from across the electricity sector, including utilities, post-secondary institutions, unions, and government, who have been exploring the urgent challenges facing the sector, particularly around labor and skill shortages, the aging workforce, technological change, and the need to align the workforce with the clean energy transition, all at the same time as embedding equity, diversity, and inclusion into that transformation. This work is part of our broader commitment to supporting inclusive innovation and skills development, and our work with the Future Skills Centre, which is committed to helping Canada build a future-ready, inclusive workforce. So we're thrilled today to share with you some of the key insights and lessons that have emerged from those conversations, along with some promising practices, partnership models, and strategies to strengthen the talent pipeline across the sector. And to kick us off, I wanted to introduce Natasha Honey. Many of you know. Thank you, Natasha, to Electricity Canada for your leadership and collaboration, and to everyone who's joining us. And Natasha is the Manager of Safety and HR Programs for Electricity Canada. She leads the sector-wide initiatives that strengthen safety, performance, and support workforce development, while advancing collaborative policy work across the sector. So with that, I'll turn it over to Natasha.
Thanks so much, Wendy. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'll start by sharing a brief overview of what Electricity Canada is and how the Energizing Talent Conversation Series came together. So Electricity Canada is the national voice of the electricity industry. Our members generate, transmit, and distribute the electricity Canadians rely on every day. We represent the sector nationally and work closely with governments, regulators, and industry partners to advance reliability, affordability, clean energy, and the long-term strength of Canada's electricity system. As electrification accelerates, ensuring the sector has a skilled, diverse, and future-ready workforce has become an essential part of our mandate. And that need is what led to the creation of the Energizing Talent Conversation Series. The series, which was developed in collaboration with Electricity Human Resources Canada and the University of Ottawa's Positive Energy Program, began early this year in response to a set of workforce pressures that are interconnected and becoming more and more urgent. Across Canada, industries are navigating demographic shifts, widening skills gaps, regional labor shortages, strained training capacity, and persistent inequities in participation. And within electricity, these pressures are amplified by the scale and speed of the clean energy transition. Demand is rising for skilled talent across trades, engineering, cybersecurity, project management, Indigenous relations, and many other roles. And because these issues touch employers, post-secondary institutions, labor organizations, regulators, and governments, no one group can address them alone. Across 3 roundtables in Ottawa and Toronto, we brought together utilities, government partners, unions, post-secondary education, and workforce experts. And each session explored a different part of the challenge, from policy and labor gaps to training and skills development and actionable next steps. And several consistent themes emerged across these discussions. Across the conversations, a clear picture of the sector's workforce pressures emerged. Sorry, I'll go back one One slide. Sorry about that. Across the conversations, a clear picture of the sector's workforce pressures emerged. Workforce planning remains a central challenge. Employers are trying to plan major projects and long-term staffing without the detailed labor market information required to do it confidently. Much of the available data is too broad or too outdated to support real forecasting. A related concern is the lack of labor input in regulatory processes such as rate applications. These decisions directly influence training investments, staffing timelines, and the pacing of major projects. Yet the people closest to the work are not always part of those regulatory decisions. Without their perspective, policy decisions can feel disconnected from operational realities. And pressures are equally visible within training and post-secondary institutions. The pace of change in the sector is accelerating, but updating curriculum, expanding hands-on learning, and supporting faculty take time, often longer than shifts in skill requirements. Institutions are also navigating funding constraints, international student caps, and limited capacity to expand high-demand programs. When institutional capacity tightens, so does the flow of new talent into the sector. Labor mobility and inclusion form the third cluster of challenges. Provinces use different certification and apprenticeship requirements, making it difficult for new workers to move where the jobs are. And major projects are feeling the impact of those discrepancies. Internationally trained workers face additional hurdles, long credential recognition processes, and uneven access to bridging programs. And across the board, the sector continues to struggle with attraction and retention, particularly among youth, women, newcomers, Indigenous peoples, and other underrepresented groups who may not see a clear entry point into the electricity sector and careers. And taken together, these pressures point to a shared reality that no one single organization can resolve them alone. And moving forward requires coordinated effort from employers, education, labor, governments, and community partners. But despite the challenges, many promising opportunities surfaced. Several groups point to proven models that are ready to scale, especially modular and micro-credential programs that help people transition into high-demand roles more quickly. There's a strong potential in co-developing programs between industry and post-secondary education. And when curriculum and training pathways are shaped together, this sector can respond more effectively as skills requirements evolve. Strengthening youth pathways also stands out, particularly those that bridge secondary and post-secondary education and expose students earlier to technical and skilled roles. Across all three sessions, one message was really consistent that there's a strong appetite to partner, but collaboration needs more structure. So clearer roles, shared expectations, and dependable mechanisms for coordination would make a meaningful difference. And beyond program level improvements, the conversations pointed to broader system level opportunities. One is a chance to reframe electricity as essential economic infrastructure, something foundational to GDP growth, innovation, industrial strategy, and Canada's broader economic ambitions. Seeing the workforce through that lens opens the door to aligning workforce planning with national priorities rather than treating it as a standalone issue. And there's also value in learning from international models, looking at regions like Germany that have successfully expanded training capacity, strengthened mobility, or modernized apprenticeship systems. And finally, Canada has the potential to lead globally on electricity workforce strategy, particularly as the clean energy transition accelerates and jurisdictions compete for the same skilled talent. Across the conversations, four near-term actions rose to the top. First, Canada needs a national workforce strategy that aligns with industrial policy. Workforce development should be integrated with broader economic, climate, and infrastructure planning. Second, industry education collaboration needs clearer structures. Employers and post-secondary institutions want to work together, but they need shared timelines, structured planning, and mechanisms to keep training aligned with real-world needs. Third, federal investments can do more to drive workforce innovation and inclusion, particularly by supporting training capacity, modern delivery models, and equitable pathways into the sector. And finally, there's strong opportunity to scale fast-track training models. These programs already show strong results in many regions, and the next step is expanding them. These actions can move the sector forward immediately while laying the groundwork for longer-term change. And although our focus is electricity, these themes mirror challenges appearing across much of the Canadian economy. Shifting skills, demographic changes, mobility barriers, and persistent inequities in access to opportunity. The conversation series shows how employers, post-secondary institutions, labor, governments, and community partners can work together differently to address shared challenges. And we hope these insights are helpful not only within electricity, but across sectors facing many similar transitions. Now that we've walked through the series, I'd like to bring Wendy back in. As the founder of the Diversity Institute, Dr. Wendy Cukier is one of Canada's leading experts on diversity, skills, and labor market innovation, and her research provides essential national context for understanding the broader forces shaping Canada's workforce ecosystem. So, Wendy, I'll pass it back over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. And I'm just um, trying to share my screen as well to kick this off. I feel like there should be music playing in the background too while I'm fumbling away. Just one moment, please. There. Can you see my screen? Okay, super. So thank you so much, Natasha. And it's been a privilege to participate in the discussions, even though the electricity sector is not my particular area of focus. As you noted, there are a lot of things that are common across sectors. And what I really wanted to focus on today was really just provide a bit of context in terms of equity, diversity, and inclusion and the role that it plays generally, but also in the sector. I'll start just by saying the Diversity Institute is based in the Ted Rogers School of Management. So our focus on equity, diversity, and inclusion, while grounded in a commitment to human rights and social justice, is very much focused on how equity, diversity, and inclusion advance organizational performance. And that's whether you're a utility, Starbucks, Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment, the city of Markham, or the regional municipality of Cape Breton. Any organization operating in Canada today where the population is changing has to adapt. It's really just marketing 101 from my perspective. And of course, you've already heard from Natasha some of the contextual factors that are shaping the electricity sector today. The technological shifts are massive. And what's interesting to me, because I do a lot of work on AI, is of course one of the big issues that is of concern in advancing AI infrastructure is the impact it's going to have on the grid. We also know that climate change, demographic shifts, and so on are important. And the demand is going nowhere but up. We also know the aging population, boomers like me, are retiring or dying off. I want to do the first before I do the second, but that's going to create massive shortages, which exacerbate the shortages that we're already seeing. We also know, and this is something that I learned through the conversations, is much of many of the players in the sector operate in rural, remote communities, particularly in the far north. There are also regional variations in terms of the concentration of the sector. Ontario, for example, has almost 40% of workers. Alberta has 10. And operating in the north presents particular challenges, not just because of various infrastructure issues, including transportation, and so on, but also skill shortages. And it was interesting to me that still 178 remote Indigenous and Northern communities still remain off-grid and I think are using diesel. The other thing is we know that poverty remains an issue in Canada, and with 20% of households earning less than $55,000 a year, energy poverty can also be an issue. As I mentioned, from my point of view, the commitments around equity, diversity, and inclusion very much grounded in the changing market. We know, for example, that women are half of university graduates, but we make 70% of the purchasing decisions. And there are still issues in terms of wage gaps and leadership gaps. We know Indigenous youth are the youngest and fastest growing demographic. And it's interesting because Indigenous university graduates, the same employment outcomes as non-Indigenous university graduates. The problem is there are far fewer of them. We also know that regardless of whether we have high rates or low rates, immigrants will continue to account for the majority of workforce growth in Canada. There's no getting around it. And I would argue, especially as we're developing new markets globally, immigrants really are a competitive advantage. And a growing proportion of immigrants are also racialized. 27%, more than a quarter of Canadians now identify as having a disability. It's partly increasing because of the aging population, but it's also increasing as our understanding of disability expands to include cognitive differences as well as mental health issues. And many of you know, in the context that you're working, that those are serious issues. And we know an increasing percentage of youth are identifying as part of the 2S LGBTQ plus community. And regardless of what percentage self-identify, the majority identify as allies. So the business case for diversity is as strong as it's ever been. As the market's changing, the talent pool is changing, the demand is changing as the market changes. And we know as well, in many professions, the majority of workers are actually immigrants. If you look at the IT sector, for instance, we over-index on immigrants and racialized people because of the focus on highly skilled workers. We also know there's a direct relationship between how well organizations do in addressing equity, diversity, and inclusion in the workplace, organizational performance, as well as innovation. And if that's not enough, our fundamental legal structure, our constitution, and our provincial human rights codes mean that there's substantial legal and reputational costs if you mess up on it. And for those of you who are negotiating with Indigenous peoples, you know how very important having commitments around truth and reconciliation are. And those are long-term commitments, not short-term. We polled, and this is all courtesy of the Electricity Human Resources Council of Canada. We pulled some of the data which compared different occupations and the percentage of Indigenous peoples, for example, which is high relative to other sectors. The percentage of immigrants, which is comparable to other sectors. The percentage of racialized people, which is a bit lower than other sectors, and the percentage of women, which remains lower than in other occupations. When you break down by core occupational groups, we can see that that there has been significant change between 2017 and 2022 in the proportion of, for example, women as managers and supervisors. It's up to almost a third of people now, double from what it was 5 years ago. And that's really an indication of the efforts that have been put in that area. With engineers, technicians, technologists, there has been growth, not as pronounced, and certainly in trades, we know women continue to be underrepresented. Interestingly, in the ICT sector, you're seeing the percentage of women decrease. And we've observed this across sectors in part because other industries are putting a priority on hiring women in ICT, and that's pulling from utilities and the public sector. When we look at racialized people, we see similar patterns. The percentage is significantly increasing over time, and close to parity with the overall population in the engineering and technical areas as well as ICT. Looking at immigrants, same thing. You slightly over-index when it comes to engineers, technicians, and technologists. and slightly under index in terms of trades. And Indigenous peoples, as I mentioned, your sector has very strong representation compared to others, in part because of the locations where you work. When we look at boards and senior levels, it may surprise you to see that your sector is one of the strongest in terms of the representation of women on boards and in executive roles. And yet we know there are still barriers to inclusion. Some of it has to do with things that are across all sectors, stereotypes and bias, particularly in technology roles. We also know, and this is broad, we also know that understanding of the sector and its importance and the opportunities that are there is really limited. And I know Electricity Canada and many of your individual organizations are really putting a priority on trying to open the eyes of young people to the great opportunities that may exist. Workplace culture can be an issue, and certainly there are studies that have been done that show that workplace issues remain a problem, and location definitely also factors in. I wanted to talk a little bit about the issues of backlash because this has gained a lot of attention, particularly south of the border. And many organizations, in my view, are forgetting that Canada is Canada. So I just wanted to walk you through some of the facts about what's going on. There's no question that for a whole variety of reasons, I think the writing was on the wall with some Supreme Court decisions that the U.S. has shifted its position, that the president has made lots of executive orders that have literally outlawed affirmative action programs. There's certainly pushback from the courts, but there's no question that organizations south of the border are scrambling to reposition their EDI strategies. And we've seen a number of high profile CEOs basically backtrack on their EDI commitments, some in not very tactful ways. The other thing that we've seen is that the drivers for equity, diversity, and inclusion remain constant. As I said, it really is, to a large extent, a function of changes to markets and smart organizations recognizing the opportunities that presents, both in terms of talent as well as products and services. And there have been high-profile events and movements, things like Me Too, the murder of George Floyd, the discovery of unmarked graves in Kamloops have all accelerated, in my view, the commitments in Canada to equity, diversity, and inclusion. We've also seen increases in certain legislation as well as commitments around voluntary codes. At the same time, we are seeing well-organized political opposition, particularly in the United States. We've seen social media and mainstream media amplifying misinformation. And because Canada is so affected by the spillover effects from the United States, a lot of people think that what's going on south of the border is also occurring here. And I would say, and I have the evidence, that's true to a very limited extent. I think there is also evidence that as people have a harder time paying their bills, they look for people to blame. And certainly a lot of the backlash against immigrants is a function of anger and discontent. At the same time, in Canada, despite all the backlash, we have seen Canadian leaders stand up and stay firm. Even in the United States, large organizations like Costco and Apple have simply said, this is part of our culture. This is part of our business. We are not changing. And it's interesting because where the anti-EDI proposals have been put to a vote, very often they have been defeated. In Canada, and this is my gift to you, we did a survey with the Environics Institute, 5,000 respondents, stratified sample. Is EDI a good thing or a bad thing? 16% of Canadians said EDI at work is a bad thing. 54%, 3-1, said it's a good thing, and the rest are on the fence. I would like you all to take a screenshot of this because it is really important to understand that equity, diversity, and inclusion remain core to most Canadians' values. The other thing that I wanted to emphasize is there are no simple solutions to complex problems. And so we think about the way forward. We have to recognize that there are issues we have to confront on a daily basis at the societal level. You have to deal with the issues about assumptions about your sector and counter those stereotypes. We have to continually advance stories of successful women in the trades, in engineering, and so on. At the organizational level, we can't back down. We have to stay the course and ensure that our equity, diversity, and inclusion strategies align with our organizational goals and objectives. And at the individual level, we all make choices on a daily basis that affect the culture of the organizations we work in, regardless of what our positional power is. And I think that's very important. So when we look at organizational strategies for equity, diversity, and inclusion, we do not believe it's simply an HR process, but part of an HR process, or just about values and culture, even just about leadership or setting measures. We believe that diversity across the value chain, starting with procurement, thinking about product and service design, is absolutely fundamental, regardless of what sector you're in. And of course, if you're looking at expanding the pool of workers, you really have no choice. And we know that those are often long-term commitments to build those relationships. So in conclusion, I would say your sector is very interesting to me, and it is very distinct in a number of ways. In part, you have long-term planning horizons that lots of other sectors don't have. And so you can see where things are going in perhaps with more foresight than others. Nevertheless, there are uncertainties, there is growth, there is transformation, and there definitely are labor shortages and will continue to be labor shortages, especially with some of the national projects they're envisaged. We know that equity-deserving groups remain underrepresented across occupations and in leadership roles in the sector, and there are barriers that continue to affect their entry and advancement. But I just wanted to really underscore that from our perspective, the goal is not to have an equity, diversity, and inclusion strategy that sits aside from your organizational strategy or your corporate strategy, but rather to think about how equity, diversity, and inclusion can be embedded. And that means having clear targets, tracking, and evidence-informed approaches. So thank you very much for your attention, and I will stop there. At this point, I would like to invite Kendra Flagler to join me for a little bit of a fireside chat. And Kendra is the Director of HR and Strategy and Programs at the Ontario Power Generation. And she's going to provide some concrete insights into what her organization is doing and what some of the implications of that are. So welcome, Kendra. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you for that warm welcome, and thank you for inviting me today. I appreciate it.
So let's start off with the sector perspective. I know that in Ontario alone, there are more than 1,200 job openings expected by 2028. When you think about OPG, what are some of the most pressing workforce challenges that you see the sector facing today?
Yeah, I think I think if there are a lot of the things that you and Natasha talked about at the start of the session today, we're seeing a huge scale of retirements with over 25% of our workforce set to retire in the next 5 years. That is then combined with the need to ramp up for major nuclear and other electrification projects. And then we're compounding that with rapid technological change. We have AI, digitization, and brand new nuclear technologies that are all reshaping the roles and the skill sets that we need. At the same time, we're facing stiff competition for skilled trades and technical talent, both not just within Canada, but globally. Our education and our training pipelines, particularly what we see in nuclear specific skills and apprenticeships, they're just not scaling quickly enough to meet the wave of demand that we have coming. And then, as you spoke about, Wendy, we and you saw the stats certainly showed that loud and clear. The sector just continues to struggle with diversity and inclusion. We certainly need to do more to attract and retain women, Indigenous peoples, newcomers, youth, and other equity deserving candidates who just really remain underrepresented in the sector. And I think there's a real opportunity for us to tap into that.
And can you talk a little bit about what some of the strategies are that you're using? I know that people and obviously there are policy shifts, but certainly there's been discussion of the growth in renewables and the impact that that's having. I think it's really your point is so well taken that you face competition not
Mhm.
just within your sector, but across sectors. So you're competing with other infrastructure related um, industries in terms of trying to attract and retain um, highly skilled workers, digitization, and you mentioned the shifts with technology. That's also having an impact. So can you talk about some of the strategies that you've seen work for transitioning workers from one sector to another, particularly into the high demand roles that you have, as we're seeing some jobs displaced and others being created?
Yeah. Yeah. We're definitely, I would say, Wendy, seeing some promising results in those sort of crossover pathways on mid-career workers coming from other sectors. I think what we're starting to do is recognize their prior learning, offering bridging training and sort of structured onboarding for workers from sectors. We've certainly at OPG transitioned some folks from, say, the automotive sector, for example. And part of that is the partnerships piece that we talked about. And we're partnering with post-secondary institutions. For example, we have a partnership with Ontario Tech University and have a program called Nuclear Career Accelerator, which is a specific program targeted to reskill the mid-career folks who are really looking to transition into the nuclear industry. Um, that's one aspect. And then I think the outreach is the other. So, targeted community outreach is certainly very key. For example, having very targeted Indigenous and women-focused pre-apprenticeship programs are helping to sort of reskill and transition talent. I think we're also, with the impact of tariffs, we're actually starting to look to pilot initiatives in conjunction with the province and other employers to map transferable skills from the sectors that are impacted by the tariffs and aim to work with, again, the universities and colleges to design some training and reskilling programs for those workers. I think those are like probably a couple examples that come to mind, Wendy.
Can I, just in a hot pursuit for the folks on the line, can you tell us what kinds of jobs, for example, within the auto sector, you've been able to transition into the nuclear sector? Like, are you able to take people off the line and transition them, or is it more the managerial staff, the engineering staff, and some of the skilled trades? Like, can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I would say we definitely have had the successes on the managerial staff. Lots of supervisory staff we brought over in the maintenance area, for example, have been quite successful. Project management is another great example. I think what you indicated the line, that's where we're trying to tap into. Like what is sort of the baseline skill set, and then how can we actually just upskill them? So we're looking at, some of those particular opportunities where Sorry, I'm getting over a cold. Radiation protection technicians, for example, that's an area where we're looking to say, hey, is that a transferable skill where we can offer a targeted program and upskill?
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We talked about everybody's mentioned the
Mm,
importance of collaboration and how employers work with educational institutions and trade unions and governments and so on. Can you talk about some examples of how utilities and other stakeholders or interested parties can work effectively together to address workforce gaps? You sort of alluded to them, but maybe you can map that out a little more detailed.
yeah, sure. Like I think something that we need to start doing is looking at sort of shared training hubs or national competency frameworks to really evaluate how we can ensure consistent and high quality training and reduce duplication. I think that's one area. I think another opportunity is where governments can help is really streamlining our credential recognition, supporting interprovincial labor mobility, and integrating more energy topics into our, kindergarten to grade 12 and post-secondary curricula. We need to get that knowledge into folks earlier. I think, and I mentioned about it, one example partnership we have with Ontario Tech. I think that utility academic partnership is really key to continue to co-design programs and embed what I'd say practical experience. We need folks to come in and not just with the theory, but have that practical experience where we can actually integrate in, industry learning and hands-on learning as part of the training programs. I think that's really important. The other piece that I'm starting to see some momentum on, and I know Natasha talked about that earlier, is data sharing, like having that unified forecast because we all are competing for the same resources. So we need to understand as a collective what is that supply and demand across the sector. And I think I'm starting to see some studies come out. So that's a really good sign that we're starting to see a little bit more collaboration in that area as well.
And it's so important. I mean, I think to underscore the importance of collaboration in the current environment, like skills and training needs to be a national project.
Absolutely.
End of story. And, I'm really glad to see some of the discussions around removing the provincial barriers, but also the barriers to internationally educated professionals, because we know that's a massive issue with engineering and trades. And I think the province of Ontario has started to move fairly aggressively in that space. So when we think about the future, and we think about the current state of affairs, if you were to look 5 years ahead, what would you think? How would you define success in addressing workforce challenges? Like, what does that actually look like?
So I guess I'd say, it would mean having robust talent pipelines, both entry level that we've talked about and mid-career transitions in. So we'd have strong pipelines there and also improved gender, indigenous, and other equity deserving representation. And then from an employer perspective, all of this is going to be reduced time to competency for critical roles, meaning that they can get to work and get proficient faster. I think we'd see those stronger, public and private academic partnerships that we've been talking about. We'd see those standardized training and credentialing. We would see that proactive workforce planning that we're working together as a sector that makes sure that we're matching the supply with the projected construction and operational demand that we'd have. And from a utility, from an employer perspective, like what would that really mean to us? It means we would have the workforce we need to enable us to deliver on our growth through our major projects and continuing to deliver those projects on time and on budget, which is very critical. And that we would have that sort of skilled workforce that truly represents the communities in which we serve.
And it's important to have that vision. I think it's important to also understand what the steps are that are required to get there. And we still got a fair amount of time, Kendra. So I just
Mhm.
wondered, do you have any, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but do you have any very specific examples of projects that have been designed to meet a particular need that you think have been really successful. So you talked in general terms about transitioning, for example, workers from one sector to another. But are there any other are there examples there of some of the work that you've done in advancing women, for example, at OPG that you'd like to talk about before we wrap?
Um, yeah, happy to. I think, I think we have done quite a bit of outreach and education. I think that's one of the key pieces. And we really use ambassadors, right? And having women that are in the trades, in sort of technical roles, and going out and speaking to their experiences. I think we can have lots of fancy programs and all these things, but actually hearing from people that are doing the work. I think having that advocacy and outreach, I think is super important. We've really transformed our sort of ambassador program to be less, I'll say, recruitment facing to actually people doing the role and speaking to that. I think that goes a long way. Um, so I think a more maybe formalized program, not specifically for women, but for Indigenous people that we are particularly proud of at OPG is our Indigenous Opportunities Network or ION program. We started that in 2018, really focusing on recruiting Indigenous candidates for skilled trades and other roles in the sector. So, we sponsor that program and provide pre-apprenticeship training. We connect the participants with mentors. We like really support them in their transition into the workplace. And we've done that. We've co-designed that program with the Indigenous communities to make sure that, it's relevant and effective. And we're seeing some really good results. We've placed just this year, we've placed 70 candidates with roles across the sector. And since inception in 2018, we've placed, over 230 skilled Indigenous workers across the sector. So I know that's one other program that we're particularly proud of.
I'm wondering, because we're hearing a lot about youth unemployment right now,
Mm,
for example, and we've also heard about the importance of, see it, be it. You've got to get those role models out there. You've got to get youth thinking about the sector early in their formulation of ideas about what their careers are,
yeah.
and so on. Have you done work with co-op programs, internships, and so on in terms of creating pathways for young people?
Absolutely. Yeah, we've really, I'll say, reinvigorated. We call that, Wendy, at OPG, our kind of early careers program. And a big part of that is our co-op and internships. We've tripled over the last 3 years the number of students that we're hiring in, coming in as students and interns. And we even use a tagline to call it, recruit once, hire twice, meaning that we bring you in as a student, we develop students, and then have the opportunity for them to transition into full-time roles and giving them actual offers when they go back to school, prior to kind of finishing their last term to come into the sector. So we're really looking at that early talent pipeline as really key. And then what we've had to do in conjunction is look at our org design. Historically, we've more had a experienced career path coming into our organization. We need to make sure that we look at our organizational design and say, do we have enough entry level positions? So we're really kind of working on that in conjunction, hiring great students and then making sure that we have the right permanent jobs for them to come into that allow them to have that career path and grow. So definitely is a key focus for us for sure.
And what about currently, like what are the skill sets that you're finding the most difficult to fill? And is it because of competition against with other sectors, or are there other factors? I assume you're suffering like everyone is from the retiring boomers. So
Yeah.
where are the pain points for you in terms of recruitment?
Yeah, I would say, like the hot topic's always skilled trades. So certainly, boilermakers, electrician, welders, millwrights, those types of trades for sure. Specialized engineering, nuclear, electrical controls, again, just competition for talent there and project management. We're having a lot of infrastructure projects across the country. So those are definitely skill sets that we have a significant demand for and have competition. But I think there's also like emerging skill sets like cybersecurity and digital operations. Those are sort of new and emerging skill sets that we're going to have a increased demand on. And I don't know that we have the pipeline for those. So I would say it's In terms of the why, it's definitely a combination of the overall demand, but also it's the long training timelines and limited program capacity that are contributing with some of these. So we have to really look at, how do we need the credentials for all of these roles? There's some, an engineer, we certainly know that you need a university degree in engineering, but there's some other areas where maybe we're over specifying the requirements. So that's something that we currently are looking at OPG as well, is making sure that we're sort of right sizing the education and experience to make sure that we're not over specifying things unnecessarily and kind of looking at it in an archaic view, if that makes sense.
No, it makes a lot of sense, and I really love the idea of an asset-based approach where you look at the individual, you look at the skills that they have, you look at
Yeah,
the skills that you really need, not the skills that you necessarily have always had, because
that's
that
right.
can embed bias. And then you try to identify what that delta is and really target the training at that. So maybe somebody didn't graduate as a nuclear engineer, but they were an electrical engineer. So what do they really need to bridge that gap? Someone
Exactly.
could be a chemical engineer. The foundations are still pretty common. And, I only say that because I've often, my dean won't like this, but I've often joked that, I can teach you everything I remember from my MBA in a couple of weeks, because the reality is there was a lot in there that was really valuable, but in terms of the core competencies that I developed through the MBA, it's a number of models, it's a number of analytic techniques, it's some vocabulary and language, and you don't need 2 years to get the essence of that.
Exactly.
And so, for me, working in a post-secondary institution in particular, I think we're kind of bad at looking at new ways of doing what we do. So it's to me, there's lots of promise in the opportunity. It's just how quickly can the institutions adapt to the needs, because as you know, most post-secondary institutions, take 2 years to get a new program approved, and then it's 4 years before the graduates come out. And that's not going to work for a lot of these short-term requirements.
Absolutely.
Um, I'm thinking now about maybe I think we've covered pretty well all of the questions except maybe the most important, which is what are the immediate priorities? If you had a magic wand and
Mm.
could say, here's one or two practical things that need to happen immediately, what would you recommend?
Yeah, I think there's sort of, Wendy, some of the things we've talked about. I would say, I think just dovetails exactly what you were just mentioning, like accelerating the process for recognizing credentials and prior learning. Like we really need to do that, especially for internationally trained professionals and skilled workers from adjacent sectors. I think this will allow us to, have qualified individuals enter the workforce more quickly, filling urgent gaps in high need roles. I always even just use myself as a use case. I have a degree in chemistry, and here I am, a leader in human resources, dealing with, workforce planning, labor relations, and so I think that's, again, thinking that around non-traditional career paths, I think is important. I sort of alluded to the second earlier in our chat as well. I would say as employers, again, we need to look at our organizational designs. We need to make it easier for people to enter the industry without navigating these long education paths. So we need to build more modular and skills first entry routes to really let people come in and helper and trainee roles and help them build the skills while on the job. This is really going to help us, widen the funnel, reduce our time to hire, attract new demographics, including the underrepresented and underemployed. So I think those are two key ones, Wendy, that we really need to focus on.
Well, and I love your example about non-traditional career paths, because that's something I'm really passionate about. And I think that, increasingly we have to think about post-secondary education as laying a foundation in terms of critical skills and certain kinds of knowledge, but recognizing with the rapid changes in the workplace, what we studied is not necessarily going to be what we use. And, fun fact, I'd had a master's degree in medieval history before I went into technology, and the rest is history. So I think when you really unpack how people got where they ended up, certainly some, decided in grade 3 that they were going to be an engineer and went straight through and became an engineer. But we know lots of engineers end up in very different roles than the ones that they trained for. And conversely, lots of people who are in arts and social sciences end up in project management or leadership roles in technology organizations. So trying to break, my only comment would be is we have to really try to break the conventional approach to career advising that we give kids, that we give newcomers, and we have to think about what are the foundational competencies everybody needs. What are the specializations that may get them in the door for their initial career, their initial job? But over the long term, we have to accept that whether through formal retraining or self-paced training, we're all going to have to reinvent ourselves because of the pace with which the world is changing. And we see this with AI, right? Half of the people who are using AI in the workplace are self-taught. And so creating more flexibility and more entry points, as well as transition points, I think is going to be absolutely foundational. We're almost at time. Are there any other comments that you want to, anything that I didn't ask you about that you would like to talk about before we wrap up?
No, I think, I would just say we've talked a lot about challenges, but I think there are a lot of opportunities. I think it's just I'll obviously have a bit of an ad for any folks that aren't in the electricity sector and on the call as well. I just think there is such opportunity here for us to truly transform and use the kind of burning platform that we have around the labor shortages within the sector to truly transform with a lot of the things that we talked about today. So, although there's a lot of challenges in all of this, I think it also presents us with a lot of opportunity, and so that to me is quite exciting.
And I will take the last word. The example that I always use is what happened during COVID. COVID was horrendous. It was a crisis beyond crises. And I wouldn't at all want to minimize the devastating effect it had on individuals, on communities, on organizations, and so on. At the same time, during COVID, employers, educational institutions, governments did things in days or weeks that previously would have taken years. We showed that we could drive change, we could achieve goals, and we could transform ourselves very quickly. I feel like after COVID, there was some backsliding to the way we always did things. And so, someone once said, never waste a good crisis. And I gotta say, like the crises we're facing now make COVID look like child's play, but it does create an opportunity to really rethink in a fundamental way how we do things and challenge assumptions. And the argument I've been advancing, and it's not just because I teach in entrepreneurship and innovation, is entrepreneurship is now a core skill, because whether you're going to start your own business, whether you're going to drive social change, or whether you're going to transform existing organizations, we need people who are prepared to challenge the status quo. And nowhere is that more true than when it comes to the skills and employment ecosystem. So really, really appreciate your time today. Want to thank everybody for joining us. Natasha and Electricity Canada for their leadership in driving these discussions forward, my team for helping to organize, and all of you for making time to participate. We will follow up, we'll make the slides available, and we'll ask for your feedback because we hope this is the first of many conversations. Thank you so much.